If you are watching Atten Recounts, you are already someone who cares about the how and why of history, not just the dates and uniforms. So, before we go any further, I want you to subscribe to the channel now and share this video with someone who appreciates serious historical analysis. Because what we are about to discuss is one of those overlooked wartime realities that modern materials science still struggles to fully replace. This is not nostalgia, and it is not romanticism. It is a practical, physics-based explanation of why something as ordinary as newspaper kept soldiers, civilians, and resistance fighters alive through winters that modern insulation often fails to replicate under the same conditions. During the Second World War, insulation was not a convenience. It was a survival tool. Soldiers slept in trenches, civilians hid in attics, barns and basements, and entire cities endured winters without reliable fuel. In those conditions, newspaper insulation was not a desperate improvisation. It was a rational solution based on availability, thermal behavior, and environmental realities that many modern synthetic foams simply do not address when removed from ideal laboratory conditions. The first thing to understand is that WWII insulation was designed under constraints that modern building science rarely considers. There was no assumption of dry, sealed environments. Structures leaked air constantly. Moisture was unavoidable. Materials had to perform when crushed, damp, dirty, and poorly installed. Newspaper excelled because it worked with these conditions rather than pretending they did not exist. Modern foam insulation is engineered for sealed cavities, vapor barriers, controlled airflow, and predictable humidity. In contrast, wartime shelters had drafts, condensation, and constant temperature swings. Newspaper's layered structure created thousands of micro-air pockets, and trapped air is what insulates, not the material itself. When packed tightly but not compressed flat, newspaper formed a resilient thermal barrier that adapted to irregular spaces far better than rigid foam ever could. Newspaper insulation functioned as a dynamic insulator. Each sheet acted as a boundary layer, slowing heat transfer through conduction and convection simultaneously. When heat attempted to escape, it had to pass through dozens or even hundreds of thin air gaps. This dramatically reduced thermal loss, especially in low-tech environments where wind penetration was, pretty much constant. Foam insulation, particularly early and even modern open-cell foams, loses effectiveness when air moves through it. Once moisture enters foam, its insulating value drops sharply and, quite often, permanently. Newspaper, on the other hand, absorbed moisture gradually and redistributed it across layers, preventing condensation from pooling in one cold spot. This reduced ice formation inside walls, which was actually a problem that plagued early military huts insulated with modern-style boards after the war. One of the least discussed advantages of newspaper insulation is its hygroscopic behavior. Paper can absorb and release moisture without structural failure. In World War II, Europe, moisture was unavoidable. Snow melted, breath condensed, and fires produced water vapor. Newspaper insulation buffered humidity changes, preventing sudden thermal collapse. Foam insulation, once wet, becomes thermally compromised and, it can trap moisture against wood or metal surfaces, which really speeds up rot and corrosion. Now, newspaper dried naturally when the heat returned. Soldiers actually reported that shelters packed with paper warmed up faster after fires were lit, simply because the insulation regained its effectiveness quickly. This was especially important when fuel was scarce, and honestly, fires just couldn't be kept burning all night. Another critical factor was repairability. If foam insulation is damaged, it has to be replaced entirely. But if newspaper insulation is disturbed, you just add more paper. Easy as that. During the war, newspapers were everywhere, lightweight and simple to transport. Civilians would insulate their walls by stuffing papers between the studs. And soldiers, they layered newspapers inside jackets, boots and bedding. Anything to keep warm. A practical modern application of this principle can be seen in emergency shelters or off-grid cabins, you know. Layered paper or cardboard can be packed into wall cavities, roof spaces, or even used as temporary floor insulation. The key, really, is layering without crushing. Air must remain trapped. This same principle applies today when insulating vehicles, sheds, or survival shelters where, frankly, modern foam is just impractical or fails because of moisture. Now, this may sound a bit counterintuitive, but newspaper insulation was actually often safer in practice than foam. You see, paper tends to char before it fully ignites, especially when it's densely packed and starved of oxygen. On the other hand, foam insulation, especially those older formulations, can release toxic gases really quickly when exposed to fire. Back during the Second World War, insulation fires were a known risk, and soldiers were actually trained to manage them. Paper would smoulder slowly, giving a bit of a warning. But foam? It burns unpredictably and can accelerate the spread of fire once it's ignited. This is, in fact, one reason why so many wartime structures insulated with paper manage to survive long-term use without catastrophic failure. Now, this is not an argument to abandon modern insulation entirely. It's more of a reminder, really, that material performance depends a great deal on context. If you're insulating a shed, bunker, emergency shelter, or perhaps an off-grid space where moisture control is limited, layered paper insulation can actually outperform foam over time. The method is straightforward: stack, layer, and loosely compress paper to maximize the amount of trapped air. And, you know, it's best to combine it with a breathable outer layer, so moisture can escape. Interestingly, many cold climate survivalists still use this method inside walls, sleeping platforms, and even clothing systems. The principle hasn't changed since 1942 because, well, physics hasn't changed either. WWII insulation methods remind us quite plainly that real-world conditions have a knack for defeating theoretical perfection. Newspaper worked because it was adaptable, forgiving, and, importantly, understood by the people using it. Modern foam, on the other hand, often fails because it assumes ideal conditions that rarely exist outside controlled buildings. If this kind of grounded, evidence-based history matters to you, do consider subscribing to Atten Recounts, share this video with fellow historians and survivalists, and let's keep these lessons alive. History does not repeat itself, but it does leave instructions for those willing to study them.